I was like the nerdiest of super nerdy 12-year-old magicians at the time of the story. It was a picture that, you can see that in the cover. When I afterwards looked back at it, that it appeared in the paper, I thought that is the most embarrassing thing I've ever seen. And now it's just far enough back to be cute.
This is the Book of Life. I'm Heidi Rabinowitz. Joel Ben Izzy is a storyteller who performs live on stage, but he started branching out into writing. His new semi-autobiographical middle-grade novel is called Dreidels on the Brain. It's a touching and funny story of a dorky kid's struggle and triumph that takes place over the 8 days of Hanukkah. Let's hear a sample of the audiobook before we dive into our conversation with Joel, whom I interviewed by Skype at his home in California. Be sure to listen for Joel's explanation of how to win a free storytelling CD.
There are all kinds of things that come in threes. Tic-tac-toe, 3 in a row. Snap, crackle, pop. 3rd time's a charm. 3 strikes, you're out. And stories, which I love, are filled with threes. It's always the 3rd son who sets off to seek his fortune and actually finds it, which works for me because I'm the 3rd son. There's Goldilocks and the 3 bears, the 3 little pigs. But those things aren't Jewish, especially the pigs. They are, as my dad would say, goyish, which is the Jewish word for non-Jewish things. For Christians, 3 is a magic number, like the Holy Trinity. And maybe, if I wasn't Jewish, spinning 3 gimels in a row would have been enough. Then again, if I wasn't Jewish, I wouldn't have been spinning a dreidel in the first place, trying to figure out whether I should believe in magic, or God, or miracles, or anything at all.
Joel, give us a quick summary of Dreidels on the Brain.
Dreidels on the Brain is a fictionalized memoir. It's kind of me, but I sort of had to change names so people wouldn't sue me later. And it takes place over the 8 days of Hanukkah 1971, when I was the nerdiest of nerdy 12-year-old magicians, back before anybody ever imagined nerdy could be cool. And I was traveling around L.A. doing magic shows, waiting for it to snow, and really kind of playing a high-stakes dreidel game with God, hoping for a miracle.
So you've just described the book, but you also said it was a memoir. How autobiographical is this story?
It's actually really autobiographical. Most of what's described in there happened in one form or another, though in the telling it's grown in my mind, and a lot of it was spread over much further times. What I found is you can pretty well condense a large chunk of a miserable childhood into 8 nights. So most is autobiographical. Some stuff is just for fun. And then sort of introducing characters, I smushed them together a little bit. My 2 magic assistants became 1. All the stuff about magic is pretty much straight out of me and my life. I was most accurate in describing events about me per se, because I knew I wasn't going to sue myself. But those were actually tricks that I did, and for some of the readings I've been doing, I went and dug out my old suitcase of magic tricks and brought out that top hat, which you read about in the book, to sort of help bring the story to life. That was my first love, was magic. I don't know if it'll come through on the sound here.
Do it again. Cool. So that's the top hat snapping open?
Silk top hat snapping open, right. Looks as good as when I got it. So, yeah, magic was really sort of my first entree into performing, and worked my way through high school doing magic shows at other schools and things, and even a little bit into college.
Very cool. Now, you are a professional storyteller. You stand on a stage to share your stories. So why switch gears by writing a middle grade novel?
That's a good question. What happened is I wrote another novel first called The Beggar King and the Secret of Happiness. It's a book that recounts my own story. I had traveled around the world for years telling stories. Then my own story took a sharp twist when I found I had thyroid cancer, which is a treatable kind of cancer. But in my case, there was one complication, which is that when I woke from surgery, And I said to the doctor, why can't I talk? He said, oh, I wouldn't worry. That nerve's in shock. Give it a couple of weeks, maybe a month. And after a month, they said, doctor, I still can't talk. He said, it could be 2 months. I wouldn't worry. And after 2 months, I finally said, doctor, I can't talk. He said, oh, if it's 2 months and you can't talk, then this is permanent. That nerve is dead, and you won't be able to speak again. I hope this doesn't affect your work.
Wow.
So that set me off on a journey as I came to accept the fact that I would never speak again and to see that as a blessing. And exactly how that all played out, that was my first book, which was filled with twists and turns. The most surprising you're probably noticing right now, in that, in fact, I can speak. So when that book came out, an editor from Dial contacted me, and she asked, are there any stories that you might think about for younger readers? And I said, well, there is this story that I've been thinking about for years that I heard on a bus, like when I was 12, about an orange. And I told her the story, and she said, that's beautiful. She said, I'd love to publish that in a book. She said, send me a sample chapter and I'll buy it. And it took me 7 years to come up with a sample chapter. I was trying to find a way to write it. And it was kind of this misty, faux nostalgic, as I look back at the Hanukkahs of my youth, I now remember blah, blah, blah. And it all sounded like garbage. And then the wildest thing happened. I just crumbled up and recycled yet another ream of paper. And then the whole tone of the book came to me in 2 words.
2 words?
In 2 words. It was like Proust's Madeleine. Marcel Proust was said to have eaten a Madeleine and his whole childhood came back. It suddenly all came to me, and I remembered the feeling of my childhood, and I remembered the frustration and the anger and the humor and the light and the darkness, and the 2 words became the title of the first chapter, which is chopped liver. He's looking for a word to describe the miracle that doesn't happen. And in fact, I'll just pull that part and read it. Mr. Culpepper also said you can define a term by its opposite, which is called its antonym. So what's the word for the exact opposite of a miracle? Like when you really, really need something to happen, even though it's a long shot. So you hope, and then when you can't hope anymore, you start to pray, and you ask God to please, please, let this one thing happen. And if it does, I'll believe in you for the rest of my life. And then, finally, when it seems like time has run out and there's no hope, at the last minute, it doesn't happen. I've been looking for a word for that for a long time. Then, a couple of weeks ago, I found one. I could read more and more, but that word is chopped liver. And there was something about that phrase that said, you know what, I can make this book really funny, kind of goofy and kind of irreverent and a little off the wall, because that's actually who I was as a kid. So somehow those 2 words, chopped liver, they let me open it up.
Very cool. Now, speaking of food, you mentioned a story about an orange that got the editor interested. So can you tell a little bit more about that story?
The story of the orange was kind of a gift I was given when I least expected it. I had a very bad day that got much, much worse, and that's described on day 8 of Hanukkah. Making them still worse was that I had to ride the RTD buses. RTD stands for Rapid Transit District, but in LA we called them the Rancid Transit Districts because they were so horrible. So I was completely surprised when, in about the foulest mood I've ever been in, an old man turned to me when I didn't want anybody to turn to me and say anything. He tapped me on the shoulder there on the bus, and he held something up for me to look at and said, "What do you think?" And I looked at it and I said, "I think it's an orange," which was true, but not a complete answer, because a complete answer would have been, "I think it's an orange. I think you're a weirdo. Stay away from me." But I looked at it for a long time and said, "Yes, it's an orange, but what do you think of it?" And I had no idea what was coming next. But he proceeded to tell a story that he had held on to for some 25 years, since he'd been a prisoner in Auschwitz. And it's a story I get to carry with me for the rest of my life and actually share in Dreidels on the Brain. And in fact, the original working title of Dreidels on the Brain was Snow and Oranges. But my editor said, it's a funny book, it's a quirky book, it's a Jewish book, it's about Hanukkah, and Snow and Oranges, I just don't get that from that title. And she was exactly right. She's great, my editor, Lori Hornick at Dial Books. She's just terrific. So I started thinking of another title late in the game, and I thought, what about Fetcher in the Rye? She said, that's good, that's funny, that's derivative, and kids won't quite get it. I said, what about then Short Boy's Complaint? And she said, same problem, and the librarians aren't going to go for it. So maybe something with Dreidels. And I proceeded to come up with every possible title that had the word dreidel in it. From Dreidel to Grave, The Hand That Spins the Dreidel, I Dream of Dreidels. I had a list of 50 titles with dreidel in it, and they all sucked. And I went in to see her in her office. I was visiting New York. I said, Lori, it's not possible. I have got 50 titles. Dreidel this, dreidel, and I said, and they all suck. And I said, what's more, like, this is driving me crazy. Like I have Dreidels on the Brain. She said, there you go. And so that became the title, Dreidels on the Brain. How I went from a storyteller to a writer. As a kid, being a writer was my dream. The idea of creating a book that somebody could curl up with. For me as a storyteller, there's a joy in being able to perform live in front of an audience, but there's a joy to really crafting and sculpting the words until they just sing and they sound right. And I should also mention that a good deal of credit goes to my wife, Tali, who became really involved with this. I was doing a project involving stories, women, and coffee in Rwanda. And then we came back after that, and she said, how's the book going? I'd been working on it for like 3 years. And I said, it's good. It's almost completely done. She said, yeah, let's see. And she looked at this draft, and she said, what if we did this? And this doesn't ring true. And she went through draft after draft. So that last 10%, that expanded to like weeks and months to get it just right. So it turns out I'm married to a phenomenal editor. And I'm very lucky.
Now, some of our listeners might not be familiar with storytelling as a profession. So can you describe the job for us?
When I was in college, I was at Stanford. I really wanted to study computer engineering. And my parents said, nope, Joel, you should give up on that dream. Computers come, computers go. You should do something practical, like storytelling, right? People always need stories. No, they didn't say that. They were thrilled that I was a storyteller, and I really wasn't very interested in computers. But I'll describe my form of the job. Performance at a school for a school assembly, or on a radio program, or sometimes on television. Sometimes it might be as an artist in residence, say, at a synagogue, where I come and I tell stories and then do a workshop in storytelling as well to help people find their own stories, which is something I love to do. And that's broadened over time. I recorded 6 different audio CDs of my story, which are described on storypage.com, which is my website. Then I kind of fell into something kind of surprising. I began to help some lawyers figure out the stories they were trying to tell in court. They brought me into a retreat. I told them stories about law and justice and old King Solomon stories. And this was back in the glory days when law firms were like tech firms now. So this was a very fancy silk stocking law firm, the firm of somebody, and somebody else. Told some stories and thought, just I'll entertain them. And afterwards, a fellow introduced himself to me, and he was the somebody else. Mm-hmm. And I thought if your name was on the letterhead of a law firm, you'd been dead for like 150 years, right? And they said, well, you're not dead. He said, no, but I might be next week. I said, why, what's that? He said, I got to explain this story to 12 people who couldn't figure out how to get out of jury duty, conveying the contents of like 28 feet of depositions. I said, wow, you measure depositions in feet? I said, what's it about? He said, well, I'm not sure. He said, look, why don't you come and you can help me figure out and turn it into a story. And so I went back with him to his office. Sure enough, he had all those depositions stacked up, and he began to describe what it was about. And, on November 2nd, 1983, blah, 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 blah. And I said, wait, what about this? And what about this? And over time, it turned into a story he could tell. And then he won his client like $50 million. And suddenly I was working for all these lawyers, which was a blessing and a curse. The good part is it was like work. The bad part is it was with lawyers. Mm-hmm. So eventually led me to working with different nonprofit groups and foundations and some high-tech people. And really, I look for people who are doing good work in the world, or they find me, I guess. People who are doing good work in the world and are somehow trying to figure out how to get their message across, helping them sort of harvest their stories and put them to use in speeches and presentations and meetings. So the story consulting is also a part of my work. It's kind of a wild career now that I think about it. I've done some work recently for Genentech, for Stanford University, for Pixar, do some things for them. Wells Fargo Philanthropy Department. It's quite an odd mix. And it's amazing how many people there are out there doing really great work. And when you say to them, what do you do? They say, well, I work for a CDFI 501c3 HJQ R357.4, which works in a medium-sized nonprofit. And people glaze over, but I say to them, wait a minute. You have the cold, dead fish problem. And they say, what's that? Well, if you sold sushi and had the best sushi in town, you'd put up a big sign that says cold, dead fish for sale. But talking to you, I can tell that there's something that's actually really great that you're doing. So let's find that story. The stories that show maybe how your organization began, the impact you have on real people, maybe the vision, maybe some jokes and metaphors that make your point. And it's become quite a good business. It's funny. It started off as this quirky thing, but now there's like huge demand for story consulting. Go figure.
That's so cool.
Yeah, totally fun. And it's nice because I do a lot of it like over the phone, sometimes travel around to, work in Rwanda, that was storytelling. And then in Mexico this year, in Ireland, there was in a festival just over the summer, telling stories in Ireland and wishing I had an Irish accent. It was not so bad as this one.
Well, speaking of flavors within storytelling, the storytelling in Dreidels on the Brain has a very Yiddishy kind of a flavor, sort of an old Jews telling jokes vibe.
An alte Kaka kind of flavor, yeah.
Right. And so have you found that today's kids relate easily to that vibe, or do they need some kind of a bridge to help them get it?
That's a great question. I think, I'll put it this way. There's no question we Jews inherit trauma, right? Mm-hmm. We've inherited plenty. I think we also inherit humor. So they do relate to it, but it takes a kind of a bridge to help them be able to find that. So first, maybe telling a story with a bit of a Yiddish accent, that does a little something. And then you start with something like Helm stories and say, the people of Helm. The people of Helm were so foolish that they believed they were wise. And they used to stroke their beards. And I haven't stroked their beards. But in Helm, everybody has beards. Men, women, children, dogs, cats, goats. They have an expression. They say, a goat can have a beard, but that doesn't make him a rabbi. And something about the character, when it's told to them, they warm up to it in a wonderful way. And they want to hear more. And the truth is that stories for today's kids is a little like water in the desert somehow. There is so much media and so much information, so much input that they get, and somehow stories land in like a completely different part. It's wild. It's like my daughter when she was little, she would like eat dinner. She says completely full, can't eat anymore, like we're done. And then we clear off the plates and like, so what's for dessert? And we'd say, wait a minute. You're too full, you can't eat any more dinner. She said, no, that's my dinner stomach. My dessert stomach is like empty. Right? And I think people's story stomachs are, in a way, a little empty. And it's one of the coolest things about my job is I will meet somebody who's like in their middle 30s, late 30s, and they say, you're Joel Ben Izzy. Do you remember you came to my school when I was a kid and you told the story about the Helmites climbing up the mountain to get the trees and then they carry the trees out and then they'll tell me the whole story. And I think, wow, they must have seen a bazillion things since then, but they remember this. Like I remembered that story about the orange. There's something about telling a story that's told in that human, warm way, or written in a way to convey that really just lands with people. And I think particularly lands with Jewish people. Though I will say that Dreidels on the Brain, I wrote it as something that would work for non-Jews as well, because I think that the humor translates, and you can see that the narrator, Joel, me again, is always building a bridge to say, like, if you're only going to learn one Yiddish word, I'd recommend kvetch, because that's a great word. Here's what it means. Mm-hmm. So it's to build a bridge, and I've already had several people write and say, wow, I'm not Jewish, but my husband is, and I understand him so much better now.
Well, that was a mitzvah then.
I hope so. I mean, I think there's something about telling a story that is almost always a mitzvah. I mean, a story is pretty much always a gift.
Yeah.
Even if you're getting paid for it, there's still something about it that's an act of giving and of generosity, and saying, here's something that touched me or happened to me, or here's a lesson I learned or a gift I was given, and I can now turn around and I can give it to you, and I still have it, but now you can pass it on to someone else. Which I guess brings us back to Hanukkah a little bit, because I really wanted something that might find something in this quirkiest of holidays. As a kid growing up, I was taught, Hanukkah, it's not a major Jewish holiday. Don't compare it with Christmas, and don't get too excited. But I wanted to be able to do something that does focus on that idea of finding light within darkness and of searching for a miracle.
Are you going to write any other books, or are you going to stick with the live storytelling?
So you could ask parents, right after that child is born, you say, are you going to have any more children? And they'll say, never, never, I'm never doing this again. Or maybe like during labor, never doing this again. This was a big mistake. And then after a while, they end up doing it. So I'm just to the point where I'm beginning to say, oh, look, this turned into a book. And actually I have ideas for several more books, depending on how this one is great out in the world. The truth is that there was so much material in this book, and my editor said it's too long for a kid's book. Had to cut out some of my very favorite parts, including a long rant about gefilte fish, which went on from my brother explaining to me that gefilte was Yiddish for roadkill. And so I've trimmed all that out, and now another story is starting to emerge with a working title, Matzah on My Mind.
You mentioned in The Beggar King that you talk about how you lost your voice and that you have it back again. So maybe you could explain a little bit. I mean, I don't think it'll ruin the book if you explain.
You always want me to give away the ending. No, that's fine. It was after a year and a half that I had come to accept that I'd never speak again, and to see that as a gift, mostly because of what it taught me about listening. And about listening as my mother was dying. As one who'd always been able to tell stories and suddenly found himself unable to speak. And of course I ranted and raved in my silence, and it was quite a journey. Learning to listen was quite the gift for me. And it was long after that a doctor who I'd seen contacted me and said, Joel, he was like this wild, mad scientist. He said, I want to introduce you to somebody who knows a special procedure. It's experimental. And if it works, it could restore some of your voice. And if it doesn't work, it could actually take away your whisper and you'd have nothing. So it was a roll of the dice. And for the procedure, they actually played one of my CDs which functioned as a print of my voice. And they said, this is how we want them to sound, let's go to work. So it was really kind of an experimental surgery to put something in my throat. You know, it's much more common now, thyroplasty, to push the paralyzed vocal cord to the center. So it's weird to think I speak with a prosthetic, but technically I guess I do. You wouldn't know that unless you heard the story.
Right.
And I sound very much like I did on that CD. Yeah. Isn't it wild what happens in life?
That's amazing.
Yeah.
So, is there anything else that you would like to talk about that I have not thought to ask you?
I want to wish your listeners a happy Hanukkah, no matter how they spell it. And I will mention that I spell it from the time I talk about Hanukkah and how nobody can agree how to spell it, and I commit to spelling it a different way each time in the book. I spell it many, many, many different ways. And I will say this. If a listener to your podcast can count the number of different ways I spell Hanukkah, the first 5 readers who contact me, go to my website, storypage.com, and email me. I will send them a prize, a copy of my CD called Lights and Laughter, Joel Ben-Izzy Spins Hanukkah Tales.
All right. What a nice offer.
So it's a challenge. Yeah.
Joel Ben-Izzy, thank you so much for speaking with me.
Hey, Heidi, what a pleasure joining you in your podcast. Really a lot of fun.
Books have dedication pages, and libraries have dedication plaques. The Book of Life podcast has dedications too. Here's a dedication for our next episode.
This is Warren Adler, author of The Sunset Gang. I'll be joining you soon on the Book of Life podcast, and I'd like to dedicate my episode to Sonia Adler, my wife of 65 years, who I love.
If you enjoy the Book of Life podcast, please become a patron at patreon.com/bookoflife. Leave a review on iTunes or a comment on our blog at bookoflifepodcast.com. You can also like our page at facebook.com/bookoflifepodcast. Follow us at twitter.com/bookoflifepod. Email us at bookoflifepodcast@gmail.com or leave us a voicemail at 561-206-2473. The Book of Life is a podcast service of the Feldman Library at Congregation B'nai Israel in Boca Raton, Florida at cbiboca.org and is supported in part by the Association of Jewish Libraries at jewishlibraries.org. Our background music is provided by the Freilach Makers Klezmer String Band. Thanks for listening and happy reading.